Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on the successful execution and the role of integrated tactical planning, presented by Oliver White. One quick housekeeping note, we will be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the button in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I'd now like to introduce our three excellent presenters. We're going to be hearing first from Todd Ferguson, an Oliver White America's lead instructor for public demand course. Past and current clients include Grundfos, Kraft, GE, and Dow. In addition, we'll be hearing from Rod Hozak, an Oliver White Asia Pacific partner. Past and current clients include Abbott Laboratories, Caterpillar, BAT, and Fonterra. Third, we'll hear from Don Howarth, an Oliver White EAME, Europe, Africa, Middle East partner, lead instructor for the public ITP course. Past clients include Zimmer Biomet, Abbott Laboratories, and Molson Coors. So let's turn our focus to the agenda and the specific topics that we'll be addressing in our webinar today. Today's agenda will include an overview of Integrated Tactical Planning, ITP, as well as the key elements required to effectively execute. The process is intentionally cross-functional, so we've also included a reference to the role of finance in the tactical horizon. The weekly process referencing inputs and outputs will be discussed, and client examples, including benefits, will be shared. Now, for those of us who aren't familiar with Oliver White, let me share a quick overview of the organization and its areas of focus. Oliver White has a global presence, celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2019. They offer a wide variety of experience across diversified industries and are known for solving problems by using their combination of practical experience and knowledge, shortening time to results for clients. And with that, I'd now like to turn it over to Todd Ferguson from Oliver White. Todd, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'd like to begin with just an overview of what we call the integrated business model. And this model helps illustrate the kinds of processes that are at the heart of every business. So for those who are unfamiliar with this model, above the red line is a reference to aggregate planning processes that are reviewed as part of integrated business planning, beginning with the product management review, where we consider projects that are on scope, on budget, on time, and is the projected portfolio aligned to strategy? In addition to, are there sufficient resources available? The demand review focuses on integrated sales and marketing plans, the center of that graphic, the output of which is consensus view of unconstrained demand to support strategy. And again, in the bottom below that red line to the left is a supply review, which is a formal mechanism to assess both internal and external capability to say yes or yes but with alternatives and recommendations to meet this unconstrained demand. Throughout all these activities, financial appraisal activities are evident combined with a reconciliation process that ensures the management business review at the very top has ample and timely information to formally authorize a set of plans to run the business, all the while connected to strategy. The processes that will be in scope for us to focus on today and that we will go into greater detail involve weekly, daily, and even hourly routines for managing and executing activities approved by management and IDP. So while integrated business planning is about realigning plans back to strategy on a monthly basis, the integrated tactical planning process, or ITP, execute these plans previously agreed upon in the IDP process, and we call these supporting processes. To help manage the impact of changes within these supporting processes, rely upon what we refer to as decision points or time frames. The time frame for integrated tactical planning is usually referred to, again, as a time fence or sometimes a planning time fence. And it might be helpful to think of the planning time fence, for example, as the time elapsed from ordering the longest lead time material to having the finished goods ready for shipping to a customer or warehouse. The term focus month in the middle of that screen is used to remind us at some point, say 3 months on the horizon, our focus begins to switch from an aggregate series of plans and activities to more integrated series of more detailed weekly and daily activities to ensure effective execution. So documenting these time fences helps organizations understand the impact of changes and when decisions do need to be made to meet customer requests, for example, and the cost of those changes. And examples can vary from inside the emergency zone, such as when an opportunistic customer order appears in the next 1 or 2 weeks. Sometimes changes can be 4 to 6 weeks out, for example, and involve the decision of substituting one variation of product for another, given changes in actual customer demand. At the end of the day, the goal is not to say no. It's about how to respond economically and all the while understand the cost of change. So at the end of the day, documenting and aligning on these decision points helps improve customer service and also helps frame the magnitude of decisions that can be addressed by those in the front lines versus decisions that may have more significant costs and require escalations to senior sales and even supply chain executives. So with this as a backdrop, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Rod to take us through key components of integrated tactical planning.
Thanks, Todd, and welcome and thank you, everyone, for attending. The definition of integrated tactical planning is important to understand in that most organisations are usually doing some of this, but really struggle to bring it all together into a seamless cross-functional process. The intent of integrated tactical planning process is to realign every week the more detailed below-the-line processes back up to the aggregate monthly integrated business planning process set of plans. It is specifically designed to keep senior managers out of the weeds. The temptation for senior managers to dive in can be too great because they've all come up through the ranks in at least one discipline and so can be very comfortable at that level of detail. That behaviour, however, is a waste of resource. So the important aspects of the definition are it's a cross-functional process that re-optimises core plans, product, demand, supply plans, every week across at least a 13-week rolling horizon. The primary behaviour required is to assume that we had a great plan last week, so the focus should be only on what's changed since then, and to answer the question, do we need to do anything about it, and if so, what? Preferably, the changes can be replanned each week without further approval, but there also needs to be a set of criteria in place that identifies when and to whom to escalate decisions required, if the impact of those changes are beyond the designated authority of the individual or team. So read that as a significant impact on cost, performance and or customer, but more on that later. The primary objective is to rebalance the changes so the business is still on track to meet the plan signed off in last cycle's integrated business planning process. This then enables senior managers to focus on the longer term horizon and support the Oliver White principle of silence is approval, which means if I don't hear from anyone, I, as a senior manager, can assume that the plan is still on track. It liberates organisations to focus on the longer-term strategic horizon and leave the detail to others. So what might this look like from a process perspective? In businesses, there are layers of process, or there should be, with different roles, horizons, and level of detail. In this case, we've depicted 3 layers which sit below the quarterly and annual cadence of the longer-range strategic plans. So why is this important? Well, there's a truism. That is, we've never worked in or with a company that has more resources than they need to get things done. So defining roles and ownership is critical in liberating people to focus on their process, knowing it is integrated within a closed-loop planning system. However, the current conditions that we're working in today seems to have stimulated some strange behaviour. For example, in one large global snack food company, who shall remain nameless, the CEO was found down in the warehouse stacking shelves to help get orders out for the people who are stocking up on things. That's a great gesture, but not the focus of attention we'd be expecting from a CEO. In the integrated business planning process, depicted at the top of this chart, is designed to stay focused on delivering the 2 to 3 business plans and strategy. And if at any point in any of the layers of process there is a departure from those approved plans, that cannot be rebalanced within the defined authorization levels and horizons. This then becomes the parameters for defining the escalation criteria. Oh, and by the way, you might be asking, how do we do this in the current climate? Our answer is focus on tightening the process. Don't invent new processes and teams, but recognise that the issue we're facing is different. This is where the integrated tactical planning process becomes the central process and governing body for managing all those changes that you are probably seeing coming at you right now. Integrated tactical planning takes the monthly aggregate plans, rates them into weekly buckets at a more detailed level, and proactively seeks out changes and misalignment on a daily basis, and then once a week has a stop and check. The plans then create the daily manufacturing or purchasing plan and purchasing plans in the near term, or if it's a pure supply chain environment, the daily delivery schedule. This is the essence of a closed-loop planning system, which is designed to accommodate continual replanning from the detail back up to the aggregate and the aggregate back down to the detail, with the intent that nothing leaks from the process. This also forms the basis of what is known as one set of plans and numbers that everybody follows. That is, follows up until it is formally replanned as a team. So exactly who's involved in the integrated tactical planning process? Let's take a look at the key roles in the process. There are 4 primary roles that drive in the integrated tactical planning process. Don't think of them as people, think of them as roles, because depending on the size of the company, it could be a group of people doing one role or one person doing a couple of roles. As an example of how not to do it, we've learned in the School of Hard Knocks from one large global food company, was that whenever there was a demand or a supply issue, it would be escalated to the general manager of the division. The general manager would then fire the problem down through his direct reports to fix and wonder why there was misalignment in the solution. We dubbed that reverse escalation. What we want from the Quorum is to manage change in a cross-functional environment, rebalance plans if possible, but if not possible, to then define exactly what the problem is to be solved, work up costed options, and then escalate, if required, to appropriate senior managers to authorise the change. And as a filter, the simple rule of thumb is that the cost of the change should be less than the benefit that is going to be derived from making the change. So let's have a look at who the Quorum is. The first is the demand manager or demand execution manager. This role is to make sure changes to the demand plan are being monitored, either through requests for change from the field or monitoring daily orders versus forecast. The key here is they are the conduit by which all demand changes are captured, managed and communicated. The days of account managers, for example, going straight to supply planners to influence what's on the schedule should be over. So the second is the supply planner or supply scheduler. This role is the alter ego of the demand execution manager. Their role is to make sure the supply replanning process meets the new demand plan or change request cost effectively. They liaise with the supply side of the business to orchestrate any change to plan, which is why this plan is often referred to as the master supply schedule, because it then controls all other plans thereafter. These 2 roles are focused on demand and supply plan changes, but there are 2 other critical roles in this team who are there to protect, if you will, the product plans and the customer policy. The customer service or order entry or promising function is there to represent customer policy in the execution of any agreed changes to policy. This department in many companies is undervalued and often out of sight, and often describe themselves as just order takers. That is, first in with an order is first fulfilled, regardless of SKU classification, customer priority, or allocation policies. But they should be a pivotal player in ensuring two-way communication and trapping abnormal demand before it makes its way to the loading dock. Finally, the product plan is represented by the product project manager or coordinator. This is not just about launching new products, it's about managing the execution of the product portfolio plans. Yes, new products, but also product trials and the often poorly managed phase out of SKUs. So let's take a deeper dive into the core plans. The first is the product management plans, and the product execution plans are derived from the product master plan, which is a key output from the monthly product management review. Just to reiterate, this is about changes to the whole portfolio of products. So the assumption must be that before these projects reach the planning time fence, they should have been effectively managed project plans for each project and appropriate resources allocated. Then the discipline in the time fence management and governing stage and gate process to efficiently and effectively deliver individual projects, with the execution then being managed through the integrated tactical planning process. It's also important that the demand and supply execution processes are well controlled. For example, making sure trials go ahead on time, sample and stocking build plans happen, and monitoring of actual customer purchase and customer pull-through rates versus the plan during the launch phase, and it occurs as a matter of process. Master data is also something that can get lost and end up playing catch-up if the processes aren't tight. A gross example I saw at a flour milling company once was when the site cost accountant leapt from his chair, tore down the stairs to stop a loaded truck leaving, because, as he said later, that was a new product and he didn't know the bill of materials or the routings, and he didn't even know what the price promised to the customer was. It's a gross example, yes, but even small errors and delays in data availability can cause huge headaches for people and the process. Some of the management issues we need to take into consideration of the projects are often managed in isolation from demand and supply. We've seen locked war rooms, secret projects being sprung on the business right at the planning time fence, which often leads to costly materials being air freighted and a costly rush to get products done. Going back to the gating process, we believe that at one of the gates, usually gate 3, there should be a must-meet criteria that stipulates a range of scenarios be done to test the potential variability of launch projections, supported by contingencies to protect against the most likely and impactful scenarios. This then becomes the integrated tactical planning's remit for managing the execution of the contingency plans should the plans not go well as planned. Finally, another area that is usually not done so well is the post-launch review, and not so much as did it achieve its financial results that the company was looking for, but more what did we learn from that process that we can then apply next time to improve knowledge and process integrity. So let's take a drop down into the next level and look at the tactical portfolio management, the overview. So it's comprised, literally, just to reiterate this point again, it's comprised of managing changes, additions and deletions to the whole portfolio inside the planning time fence, such as what's going into the portfolio in the way of new products, launch planning, post-launch review, and end-of-life management. The other is management of critical resources such as R&D and plant scheduling, which sometimes left up to chance. It handles measuring performance through this period, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, with an eye to increasing certainty of planning and speed of delivery, and ensuring discipline and rigour in process adherence and applying the learning as we gain experience by doing. Let's take a deeper dive into the product lifecycle and portfolio management area. So with regards to product lifecycle management, it's important to understand where each product fits into its lifecycle, and integrated tactical planning in a product sense is part of making sure the execution part of the product portfolio plans are well managed. If you think about the lifecycle curves of each product from introduction through growth, maturity, saturation and decline, you can see that excellence in product control is multifaceted. Managing the introduction of new products and services is hard enough, but they may also happen in waves. For example, phased rollout by region or by channel, or in my part of the world, the grocery trade only has 2 windows every year to introduce new products. So it can be fraught with uncertainty and be one of the more exciting places on the planet to be at times. But then it's followed by that nail-biting hypercare go live period, which needs a lot of attention. Then there's the not so exciting part of managing the phase out of old products and services, which can often be an afterthought and poorly managed and poorly resourced in most companies. Also, there's the world of mergers and acquisitions and sometimes subsequent divestments. Those projects can be massive, not to mention the resource drain on the business, and need to be well planned and resourced at that execution phase. And then as an outcome of good process, key insights and lessons learned in product control should be analysed and communicated back to the product management review to improve the quality of next cycle's product plan. And it does raise a couple of questions for organisations to ponder, and they are: how often is the portfolio reviewed and how rigorous are you in removing the clutter? Often this is done once a year at budget time, and people are so stressed getting budget done that nothing's ever put up for deletion. Another question is, how good are you at launch phase measures to test process, for example? One marketing director of a medium-sized FMCG company said to me they missed their February milestone launch measures because Christmas got in the way. Unfortunately, I couldn't help myself and quizzed back, "Didn't you see Christmas coming?" That wasn't appreciated. But this did indicate that the resource and project planning is poor and uncoordinated in that tactical horizon in that company. Another question is, what's the capability of the process in way of speed to market? That same marketing director answered the question with, we've been driving velocity and execution for a year, but they didn't have a speed to market measure. And when we did do the analysis, the average time to launch had actually increased over the year. Yes, there are a few extenuating circumstances, but measurement's important. So with those questions to ponder, I'll hand over to Todd to take us through a deeper dive into demand execution.
Great, thanks, Rod. So in the demand execution graphic, you'll see some similar types of activities in a different way, for example, in the boxes, but below the line supporting processes, and similar types of questions as Rod has taken us through on the product execution side. So not surprisingly, as we get closer in and move from the midterm planning horizon to next week or month, actual demand rarely forms exactly as planned. This won't be a surprise to anybody probably on this call or listening today. The question is, how do you deal with it? So similar on the product side, on the demand, we also have similar types of responses and questions and decisions needed. And therefore, a formal communication process is needed to help ensure actions are taken to reconcile to the original demand plan, all the while optimizing customer service. Alternatives and recommendations may feel somewhat limited and costs for change relatively high, harkening back to the need for cross-functional collaboration. And in the demand execution space, this would involve functional titles such as customer service, demand planning, sales, and marketing to ensure decisions are agreed upon and resulting potential trade-offs are clear and understood. If we focus on the boxes in the middle of this graphic, I'd like to point out a few pieces of information. First of all, under market management, what do we mean specifically? Well, we're talking about those activities tied to promotional planning, competitive impacts, external factors that might impact execution. In the demand management spot, what we are focused upon is demand planning involving statistical forecasting, analytics, and insight. And in sales management, particularly we're thinking about pipelines of activity, customers, and opportunities, for example. I have a client who's using the ITP process to address opportunistic demand. And one of my clients expected changes to be present in the near term and specifically wanted their ITP process to be nimble enough to ensure that when customer opportunities sprang up in the marketplace, a formal process was in place to help assess, define, and ultimately decide if and how to respond. When weaved together, there are several activities that combine to form a good, solid demand execution process. So an integral element of demand execution is the ability to recognize and document what we refer to as abnormal demand. So let's spend just a couple minutes on what we mean by abnormal demand. If you look at the language, it may sound very straightforward, but a best practice in integrated tactical planning is to manage exceptions. So in other words, not every deviation is cause for firefighting, meeting, or escalation. With this in mind, understanding what constitutes a significant deviation of actual demand, in this case, in real examples, this could be requested product or actual customer orders in your organization, and we compare that to planned demand. What was projected to materialize in the form of demand 2 months or 3 months ago as an example of your aggregate integrated business planning demand review or process, and we compare those two. So that planned demand versus the actual demand forms our starting point. And this can vary, this definition, across different clients. One client, as a starting point, put their best foot forward with a draft statement that simply read, quote, abnormal demand equals customer orders that are outside of the normal range assumed in planning, end quote. Over time, they worked to refine this, aided with data, business knowledge, but simply having some parameters to start with fostered a really good discussion regarding what normal means. And of course, how that might vary from one customer, product line, or SKU across the entire portfolio. It gave them a starting point and rallying point to help drive meaningful and impactful business discussions. Note also that abnormal demand can exist at various levels. So some additional examples and things to ponder for those who may be starting this journey or have a process in place that identifies deviations. This abnormal demand does not just have to be product specific. It could be new customers, a new ship to location, a significant quantity for that item, for that customer, and it could also be a single event or it can be cumulative. For example, what percentage of demand has been consumed through week 2, for example, compared to what we expected? Or does the customer always place their large orders in week 3, so no panic? So understand the order pattern becomes very important. It also calls out the role and who should be actually monitoring that demand as part of this process. So the process to recognize abnormal deviations between planned and actual demand should be formalized, documented, and systematically tracked. And I'd like to leave you with the thought. If you look at this table under what we call monitoring demand, we are talking about differences and variances that we just went through in the previous slide, but having the relevant information becomes just as critical as the information itself and the right questions. And so working left to right, where periods denote actual weeks, where having the ability to take a monthly demand plan and disaggregate that plan is critical. So in our example, as you see these periods and weeks, it's intended to highlight the weekly pacing of real demand in the form of customer orders versus that planned demand. And as we think about the focus and what we call key questions, whenever data appears different than planned, we want to consider that some of the deviation may be explained as demand that is simply yet to be received, but will materialize in the last period or week. In other words, some customers, again, always place their orders in that final week of the month. Having that business knowledge is important, as Rod talked about the roles and information aided by technology. And also decisions that need to be made whether to consume the forecast or roll it over into future periods with the assumption that there's been a timing shift and that the demand will materialize then. But in either case, just to stress this point, having a framework and the right people involved to monitor that demand affords the business to be able to be more proactive and less reactive. You will note that this example goes up 4 periods or 4 weeks. As we talked about in the time fence discussion or decision points, it's completely dependent upon your business. And we work with clients where this time frame could be 4 weeks or 14 weeks. It could be a week or 2, or it could be several months. It just depends upon the time fence and your cumulative lead times and also order lead times. I will also like to add one final point, which I think is important. Sometimes software integrators and others tout how technology can do this, sensing this demand. I would argue that you should always leverage technology, but this example also calls out the importance of having trained hands in addition to software to effectively ask and answer these questions. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Dawn, who will take us through some of the supply execution activities.
Thanks, Todd, and hello to everybody. So as we start thinking about what it means from a supply execution, the first thing really is to define the role of supply or the scope of the supply. So as you can see here, we talk about the supply point management, and just to clarify what that means, when we talk supply points, we're talking about individual nodes within the supply chain, which could be a manufacturing site, a distribution location, or any discrete part of the organization. For example, some companies have a contract purchasing classed as a separate node. So it depends on your organization as to how many supply points that you have within your organization, and therefore the level of planning within that. And really within supply execution, we're talking about the two key areas. One is the creation of the schedule or the plan for the time period that we're focusing on, 13 weeks. And then secondly, to manage any change that occurs within that plan once it is being created. So in terms of the creation, we're talking really about key areas of alignment of the plans across all of the functions. So we'll talk about the individual supply functions in the next slide, but as we've already heard about, it's very important that we have the integration with the product execution and the demand execution. We're also then talking about consistent communication of those plans so that we're always working with one set of numbers and there's always only one live plan at any one point in time. So as we say then, it's the creation of that plan and then it's the management of the change. Many clients say to us that change is just too frequent, you can't have the control of your plan, far too many changes, and woe is me. And really, in the world of supply, we often hear that all of the changes are caused by demand. And it's not their fault, they are perfect, and if only the forecast was accurate, then all these changes would stop. And in reality, once you start working through with these clients about change, it's often the case that the change is at best 50-50 between supply and other functions. In the worst case, I've seen 80 or 90% of changes caused by supply themselves through lack of integration with plans, having unrealistic plans to start with, or just not understanding the role or the consequence of their actions when they make one change and it causing a knock-on effect. So it's really important that we have these processes that gain control, manage the change and work towards creating a stability within the plan that you can then use as a springboard for improvement. And there's one other key area to note within here from a supply execution is that very much because the snowball gathers speed and size as it rolls downhill, supply is often the one area or the key area where it can act as the eyes and ears of the organization and feeding back to the integrated business planning process that something has changed. All of a sudden your warehouse is full because you're not selling as much. Demand will tell you individual customers and the monitoring will pick it up. But very often supply see it in a different way and both sides need to tell their own story and to raise the flags where necessary to the integrated business planning process so that action can be taken as quickly as possible. But in terms of the actual scope, purely within supply, as you see on the left-hand side of here, you talk about the product and demand that Rod and Todd have already mentioned. And then when we talk about supply and the individual areas that we're focusing on here, you can see that each supply point or each node in your supply chain will have one, if not all, of these areas that we need to focus on and have good, robust processes, such as a detailed scheduling process that covers the whole of the integrated tactical planning horizon in a sufficient amount of detail that everybody can get the information that they require from one central place without having to second guess and without having to make numbers up even in order to do their own job. So for example, we often see clients where they'll have a detailed plan 1 week out and then this void until the long-term integrated business planning process takes hold and has the monthly plan for months 2, 3 or 4 onwards. And yet you have items that have long lead times from suppliers that you don't have really a true picture of when you need them because you're not planning in sufficient detail. So the supply execution has to be at the appropriate level of detail. It also has to be perpetually managed. It can't be a static process that you update literally once a week and never in between whenever things change. So again, we often see many companies where they'll have a material requirements planning process that they only update once a week. And yet constantly, day in, day out, there are small changes in timing, in quantities that really you need to react to. So it's about, again, having the right cadence of your processes such that everybody has that piece of information that they need without second guessing. And this supports your order promising. One of the key aspects within the demand execution is to have good available to promise. And that relies on having reliable, credible plans in your system for all of the nodes in your supply chain to drive that promise that you meet your customer's expectation. A couple of areas that are often overlooked in the supply execution are some of the supporting functions like maintenance and quality. And if you think about in a highly regulated business such as pharmaceutical, quality is in fact, it's almost like a manufacturing node of your supply chain in that quality manufacture test results. And without that important operation within your supply chain, you can't sell your product. So many of the aspects that apply to a manufacturing area apply to these support functions as well. And as I said, it's often overlooked, it's highly critical, and it can often be the bottleneck within an organization. So when we're looking at the supply planning and execution phases, we're really looking for consistency of approach, and we're looking to be able to measure all of these areas, both within a single node and across multiple nodes, to know our true capability. And from a multiple node point of view or multiple site point of view in an organization, I think it's often true that you treat your family worse than you treat your friends. And that in many organizations where there are sites that make the same product or distribution networks that you have to go through in order to sell to the end consumer or customer, there's often a lot of finger pointing about whose fault it is. And this is often down to a number of issues, but usually fairly simple to resolve. But for example, knowing first of all the end-to-end lead time of your whole supply chain, as well as the individual lead times of different operation steps within a single node. And how many companies really and truly know this? In many companies I've worked with, when we do the exercise of mapping out this end-to-end lead time, they have a huge shock of realizing it can often be 6, 9, even 12 plus months if the whole supply chain is empty. The second is having consistent processes between the nodes. Now this doesn't mean that every node has to work exactly the same way, but every node has to know how each node works, and they all have to work consistently each time. And so that part of that is having the standard metrics. It's about having the standard communication between nodes. It's about having standard processes and really understanding the end-to-end model and your place within that within an organization. It's also important as well, from the third point, is to have consistent master data. For example, if you call something an apple in one location, it needs to be an apple in the other locations as well. And often master data, especially in a world where organizations have come from a fragmented past, is a big issue in that there is not that consistency in item and custom numbering throughout the supply chain. So having that model and knowing where you sit, having an integrated tactical planning process that joins the various dots together within your organization as well as within your node is going to lead you to a successful overall process. Now, we've talked about product and demand and supply, but there's one other key element in here where everybody gets very excited about, and I'm going to hand you back over to Todd, really, to talk a little bit more about finance responsibilities.
Great. Thanks, Dawn. That's absolutely true, and what a great segue. So up until this point, we have discussed the quorum of key roles to drive effective discussions and decisions in ITP. We would be remiss if we did not mention the role of finance. So as you work your way through this slide, just these bullets here to reinforce, not only does finance support each of the groups by offering a concerted financial appraisal of the impact of changes, it's also helpful in terms of scenarios and really a link to some of the near-term financial processes that can benefit from the information that's being shared on a daily, weekly series of activities and across the different groups. So one of the clients that we're working with right now has a near-term estimate process. Conversations sometimes in the ITP process seep into near term. What ITP has enabled them to do is to clarify the role of finance and through proper integration points, starting to provide them clarity on the changes impacting short-term financials. But at the same time, just as importantly, divorcing this discussion from creeping into their mid to long-term IDP process, which is, again, 4+ months in the future strategic focus. A couple of key areas worth noting around finance. So finance supporting scenario-based decision-making, while some of these implications of weekly changes can be reviewed by those executing the operational plan, based upon roughly right rules of thumb, for example, finance can be called upon as an analytical partner to provide a financial analysis for different decision scenarios. And especially in the integrated system enabled by IDP, finance often has planning templates. So they're a great source of information, a wealth of information that can be used to quickly turn around a roughly right financial-based analysis. And the second point I'd like to make is finance should also provide a bridge between the decisions made in ITP and the forward implications for the longer IBP planning horizon. They do this in a number of different ways, ensuring integrity of the IBP financial appraisal process by picking up the ITP changes through the monthly cycle. These changes impact revenues, costs, and our assets, especially inventory or other components of working capital. And they can help reflect these changes in the IBP forward financial view by incorporating the impact of ITP decisions as appropriate in the IBP plan. So how does everything we discussed, Quorum, product demand, supply execution, culminate into a regular routine cadence? I'd like to share with you now just the series of activities that have come together in a coordinated process called the weekly ITP review. So if we stand back from what we've heard so far and think about the integration points, you've heard the term and phrase decisions several times. This review by itself does nothing unless we actually have the right information flowing into it and also out of it. So fundamentally, the output of a mature process will be able to effectively answer the question, are we on track to meet the first 3 months of the integrated business planning process set of plans? Input, working left to right on the screen, in this graphic from the various cross-functional teams focused on changes from prior daily, weekly plans are assembled and coordinated to ensure consensus is reached and then informed to appropriate internal and external customers, the likes of which you see depicted here. Leadership, other people that aren't in the review, similar to an integrated business planning process. A mature process is continuous planning and replanning and escalating where possible and appropriate, but also driving down to lowest level of decision-making authority. This is accomplished because we have standard agendas and expectations of preparedness by key attendees ensure process discipline. Not to over-rotate and to make this more formal than needs to, but the right level of information escalates to the right people at the right time. Daily, weekly activities coming together. So these weekly meetings have a focus to the planning time fence, which again can vary by organization, but a couple key pieces to mention. The process integrates information with the weekly and daily and monthly process. Outputs can actually feed the long-term IBP process, for example. Assumptions you've identified that did not materialize could also help feed longer-term IBP. The agenda is very similar to what we might look like in an IBP process, so we're leveraging best practices, which is fantastic. And key elements are significant escalations and actions to ensure we meet the plan. I'd like to lastly just mention, it may also or may not surprise you that to effectively operate the new process, a new set of behaviors will need to take hold. Now, this includes some who actually like to firefight and get in the weeds. And in fact, one of my early on tasks when we began our journey as a client with the beginnings of ITP was to actually have my boss fired from the meeting. He was VP of sales, by the way, which wasn't easy. I reported directly to him. We had to demonstrate we were in control and be sure to inform and escalate where necessary, but we didn't want him in the details and his focus and efforts could be maximized elsewhere. We wanted instead to design a process to inform and escalate where necessary. So with that being said, I'll now turn it over to Rod to share a sample of benefits clients are realizing when running integrated tactical planning.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Dawn. I just thought I'd put a couple of quotes from our clients and what they've found from the process. And the funniest one, I think, is the first one. Before ITP, the CEO installed a window the whole length of the new offices so that management could see inventory levels in the warehouse. And when it started to cover the bottom of the window, everyone would panic. But now, people rarely look out the window. But others have been fairly simple ones. Since ITP, our DIFOT rarely dips below 97%. And the interesting thing is when it does, they know why beforehand. And the last one is in 12 weeks, so the results can come really quickly. Inventory fell 38% in value and DIFOT jumped to 97%. And I remember the starting point was low 70%. So just some examples of what can happen with a robust ITP environment. So I'd like to hand back to Bob, look at some of the questions we've got coming up, and thank you for attending.
Well, thank you very much, and we do indeed have some questions for our speakers, and we're going to start with a question directed to Rod. How does ITP work in the current COVID-19 environment?
Good question. Thanks for the question. And it being so topical, I thought that this one might come up. There are a couple of things to consider and potentially to reorientate your thinking. The first is best told by a CEO's question who asked recently, how do you communicate to people to work as though it's business as usual in the current situation? And I think the answer is obvious. It's not business as usual. But the important thing is not to confuse communication and the issue with process. It's the issue that is different, not the process. And as a colleague says all the time, you better get good at this stuff in the good times because you're certainly going to need them in the bad times. Hence, the focus should be on making the integrated tactical planning process tighter and sticking to the integrated business planning cycle, albeit with greater single-mindedness due to the current circumstances. And as a client in Singapore recently said, while everybody's a little stressed, we're keeping calm, we're objectively assessing each new fact as it's presented and leveraging our integrated tactical planning process to respond appropriately. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much. This next question is for Don, and I apologize, Don. It's pretty existential. It can be applied to any aspect of the supply chain, if not life, but let's narrow it down to ITP. How do you do this when everything is changing every day?
Well, thanks for that. As you might have gathered from what I was talking about earlier, this is something that's key to my heart. And the key is discipline and rigor and to use continuous improvement and root cause analysis. A quote from an operations director that I worked with in the US was, "It's amazing how many unplanned events you can actually plan for." And by that, it was because he realized that many things were self-inflicted and that despite feeling like a victim initially, they actually could resolve them at root cause and get rid of the problems. So when clients say to me, that we're getting 100 changes every month, how on earth will this ever work? The answer is you eat an elephant one bite at a time. You measure, you understand what's causing the changes, you fix the reason for the changes, and then you will you get away from the firefighting. And the problem in many companies is people love the firefighting. It gives them that adrenaline rush. They love to think they've saved the world. But you need to change the approach to one of intolerance that things go wrong.
Okay, thank you very much for that. This question for Todd, should we be using the ITP right now to manage the current environment or organize a war room like many other companies are doing?
Yeah, great question. I almost want to put a banner, across this session today. Change is constant, right? So I think, Bob, there's tremendous uncertainty with how to respond right now, which is understandable. And I suppose no doubt daily, and in some cases hourly communication updates are the norm. So I would say a fluid ITP process can help alleviate the need for more event-driven activity and potentially streamline daily, weekly activity into focused decision-making. And I would also, as I mentioned before, talk about communication rhythms. So we always want to understand who's involved in any war room type of activity. I gave you my personal perspective and journey as we started out as a client, but what can be replaced by integrated tactical planning? So what is happening today in businesses, and be clear to ensure that senior leaders are informed of changes inside the execution window. I think ITP enables those closest to the situation the opportunity to work through alternatives and recommendations and escalate only when truly necessary. And to put a big exclamation point on this frees up the senior executives to focus when it's critical and afford them the time to do so, which I don't think has ever been more relevant than in the current environment that we find ourselves in. So just some perspectives and perhaps some thoughts.
Thank you. Back to Rod on this one. How do you structure ITP? Is it a single process or many? Rod, you with us? You may be muted. Are you with us, Rod?
Sorry, I was muted. So, yeah, great question. And the answer is it depends. But let me just go through a couple of items there. The overarching integrated business planning process is an aggregate business planning and management framework, which means it's deliberately designed not to operate in the detail level. But integrated tactical planning is meant to operate at that level and therefore often requires a different structure to the integrated business planning process. In the interest of keeping it simple, the default position is to try and only run one, but and that's possible in many smaller organisations. But in larger organisations, the level of detail can often be too great to make good decisions or manage the data. So the guidelines I often say is, look, do the numbers. Look at the number of SKUs, the number and types of sales channels, the number of manufacturing and distribution sites, and the breadth of geographic locations, and even sometimes the range of product sourcing mix, whether it's multi-site for the same product is one example. So the simple answer is it depends. But some of the common configurations we've assisted companies set up are in a by grocery category in a multi-site manufacturing business, by sales channel in a global dairy company, by therapeutic categories in a pharmaceutical company, and by total company in a small multi-channel food processing company. So in summary, the structure depends on the structure and complexity of the organisation, but more often than not, there is a need for more than one process to effectively manage that level of detail and facilitate making good decisions.
Thank you very much. Dawn, are there specific computer systems that are designed to do this?
There are, but generally I would say that all ERP systems will support these processes in their standard format. The problem many companies have is that they don't set up their ERPs with these processes in mind, and that when they come to try to reconfigure at a later date, they find that, ERPs are a little bit like concrete in that it's fine when it's wet, but as soon as it sets, you're in trouble. And they find that, they really haven't got the system set up to do what they want to do, rather than the system isn't capable of it. We also find a lot of times where people haven't educated their people on how an ERP system can actually function. And so people are pressing buttons that they've been told to press, not understanding what it's doing. So the tool is very rarely the problem in its vanilla state. And we spend a lot of time with clients helping them both to unravel a poorly implemented ERP, but thankfully increasingly to get involved before they spend their money on them, to actually make sure that they can set up the systems correctly from scratch.
Thank you very much. Todd, how did you come up with 13 weeks? Can the planning time fence be different from 13 weeks?
Yeah, great question. Sure, fair question. And I think 13 weeks, as you've heard from my colleagues here, and it's supported by a lot of the literature that we published, is a starting point, and it's an example. It's also to compare and contrast with the integrated business planning horizon, which, if you were to do the math, is the fourth month going forward. But the answer, Bob, is that the 13 weeks is an example after working with a broad range of companies and industries. So I would consider it as a starting point. And you have to respect the horizon in which we plan IVP, again, 4 to 24 months, being aligned to aggregate activities influenced by strategy. there is value in keeping it simple. And through the process of designing your ITP process, we'll need to look at, for example, what does that look like, the lead time by products, by categories, given production and procurement lead times. And some companies have longer, some have less, but we need to make sure that we start with something simple. It's also an opportunity, quite frankly, this discussion on playing time fences and lead times, to think about collaboration internally. So there may be a group or the supply chain group that actually has for certain categories much of this defined and documented. What a wonderful thing to leverage as a starting point. But we would say keep it simple to start out with, and then refine over time and focus on the problems that we're trying to solve by defining any kind of time fence to start with. That will become critical and pivotal in your integrated tactical planning process.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to wrap up this presentation now. I just want to say that any audience questions that were not addressed during the presentation, our speakers are more than happy to answer them offline. But for now, I want to thank Oliver White and its three excellent speakers, Todd Ferguson, Rod Hozak, and Don Howarth. And I also want to thank our audience for listening in. Everybody, have a great day.